There is a planet at the edge of the Cathara expanse that does not appear on most galactic navigation charts, not because it was never discovered, but because every civilization that discovered it quietly agreed, without formal discussion or diplomatic treaty, to simply pretend it did not exist. Its designation in the Galactic Cartography Archive is Theta Minoris IV, but among the dozens of spacefaring species who had attempted to settle it, surveyed it, or simply passed too close to its gravity well, it carried a different name entirely. The Vorkai called it Shet Anu, which translates roughly as the world that eats hope. The Delhari called it Mirosin, the patience of death. The Krelian collective had no name for it at all. Their scouting vessels had approached once, scanned the surface for 11 minutes, and immediately filed a unanimous recommendation that the planet be quarantined, avoided, and removed from all future colonization shortlists. The recommendation was accepted without debate. That was 412 years ago. In the centuries that followed, Theta Minoris IV became something of a legend among the galactic community. A cautionary tale told to young cadets in the Interstellar Exploration Corps. A ghost story passed between colonial survey teams during long, deep space transits. A philosophical puzzle debated in the halls of the Galactic Senate. Why did a planet with liquid water, breathable atmosphere, and abundant natural resources remain completely uninhabited? The answer, to anyone who had studied the planet's geological and meteorological records, was simultaneously simple and terrifying. Theta Minoris IV was trying to kill everything on it, not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that any harsh environment might be described as hostile. The planet was, in every measurable scientific sense, actively, relentlessly, and creatively lethal. Its tectonic plates shifted not in the slow geological timescales common to most terrestrial worlds, but in sudden, violent lurches that could swallow entire mountain ranges in hours. Its weather systems were not governed by simple thermodynamic principles, but by a complex, chaotic interaction of three competing atmospheric pressure belts that produced storms of a scale and ferocity that had no equivalent in the galactic meteorological database. Its native fauna had evolved not merely to survive these conditions, but to weaponize them. The apex predators of Theta Minoris IV did not simply hunt. They coordinated. They planned. They had, over millions of years of brutal evolutionary pressure, developed what xenobiologists reluctantly classified as rudimentary tactical intelligence. And beneath all of it, deep in the planet's churning mantle, a geological phenomenon so rare it had only been observed on 3 other worlds in the entire recorded history of galactic exploration: a resonance cascade, a self-amplifying feedback loop in the planet's magnetic field that periodically, unpredictably, and catastrophically disrupted every piece of electronic equipment within a several hundred-kilometer radius. Communications, navigation, life support, all of it gone, without warning, for hours at a time. The Vorkai had lost an entire colonial expedition of 1,200 settlers in their first attempt. The Delhari had managed 18 months before a resonance cascade coincided with a Category 9 storm and a tectonic event, eliminating their outpost completely. The Krelian collective, after their scouting report, had never attempted landing at all. 7 other species had tried in various configurations of optimism and technological confidence. All of them had left, most of them quickly, some of them in pieces. And so Theta Minoris IV sat at the edge of the Cathara expanse, patient and enormous and utterly indifferent, waiting for something that was strong enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to stay. It did not have to wait forever. Ambassador Velthari Osson of the Vorkai hegemony had served in the Galactic Senate for 31 years. In that time, she had witnessed things that had reshaped her understanding of the universe. She had negotiated the Cathara peace accords. She had watched the Delhari make first contact with the Isin. She had seen empires rise and political alliances crumble and species evolve their entire governmental structures over the span of a single senatorial term. She had thought, after 31 years, that very little could surprise her. Then the humans had applied for a colonial development permit on Theta Minoris IV. She read the application 3 times before she called her aide into her office. "Sarath," she said carefully, holding the datapad as though it might bite her. "Did someone file this as a joke?" Sarath, a young Vorkai male whose blue-gray scales had not yet deepened to the darker tones of full maturity, glanced at the document and blinked all 4 of his eyes in rapid succession, the Vorkai equivalent of a bewildered double-take. "I verified it twice, Ambassador. It appears to be a legitimate application. Full Colonial Development Request, Category 7. Submitted by the United Earth Colonial Authority. Signed by Director Amara Osei and countersigned by Admiral James Vance of the Earth Defense Fleet." "They want to build a colony," Velthari said flatly, "on Theta Minoris IV." "Yes, Ambassador. The planet that killed the Vorkai expedition of the hegemony year 1847. Yes, Ambassador. The planet that the Krelian Collective, Sarath, a species whose threat assessment matrices are the most sophisticated in the known galaxy, refused to even land on." "Yes, Ambassador." Sarath paused. "They've also submitted environmental projections, geological survey data, proposed settlement infrastructure plans, and a 50-year developmental roadmap." Velthari set the datapad down on her desk very slowly. "How long have humans had faster-than-light travel?" "Approximately 63 of their years, Ambassador." 63 years? She was quiet for a long moment. "We had faster-than-light travel for 400 years before we attempted Theta Minoris. And we failed." Sarath said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "Schedule a meeting with the human delegation," Velthari said finally. "I want to speak to them before this goes to the full Senate floor, because either they know something we don't, or they are about to make a catastrophic mistake, and I would like to know which one it is before I decide how to vote." The human delegation to the Galactic Senate occupied a modest suite of offices on the eastern wing of the Senate complex. Compared to the sweeping architectural grandeur of the Vorkai or Delhari embassy spaces, the human offices looked almost deliberately understated. Functional, practical, the kind of space designed by people who were more interested in getting work done than in making an impression. Velthari found this in retrospect should have told her something. Director Amara Osei was a small woman by human standards, though to Velthari's Vorkai eyes, all humans looked somewhat fragile, their soft mammalian bodies lacking the natural armor plating or chemical defenses common among most galactic species. Osei had dark skin and close-cropped gray hair and eyes that were, Velthari noticed immediately, doing something that human eyes often did in diplomatic meetings, cataloging everything, recording, processing. She stood when Velthara entered and offered the human gesture of greeting, extending one of her small five-fingered hands. Velthari pressed her palm against it in the accepted cross-species diplomatic contact. "Ambassador Ossel," Osei said warmly, "it's an honor. I've followed your work on the Cathara Accords for years." "Director Osei." Velthari took the offered seat across the low table. "I will be direct if you don't mind. It is something of a Vorkai tradition in preliminary diplomatic discussions." Osei smiled. "I appreciate directness. Please. Your application for a colonial development permit on Theta Minoris IV. I want to understand it." Velthari folded her hands on the table. "Not politically, not procedurally. I want to understand why." Osei nodded slowly, as though she had expected this question. Perhaps she had. "What do you know about Earth's geological history?" Osei asked. Velthari tilted her head. "Broadly, a terrestrial world, tectonic activity, variable climate zones." "Let me be more specific." Osei leaned forward slightly. 4.5 billion years ago, something the size of Mars hit our planet. The impact was so severe that it melted the entire crust. A significant portion of Earth's original mass was ejected into orbit and eventually formed our moon. She paused. Earth survived that, rebuilt itself, developed life. Velthari said nothing. "Approximately 66 million years ago," Osei continued, "an asteroid roughly 12 kilometers in diameter struck our planet. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons. It triggered wildfires across entire continents. It blocked sunlight for years. It killed approximately 75% of all species on Earth." Another pause. "Life survived, adapted, rebuilt. I am familiar with mass extinction events. We have had 5 of them," Osei said simply. 5 times something has tried to reset Earth completely. 5 times life found a way to continue. And the species standing in front of you right now? We evolved during an ice age. We spread across every continent on our planet before we had writing or metal tools or agriculture. We crossed oceans in wooden boats without navigational instruments. We survived plagues that killed 1/3 of our population and kept building civilizations. She met Velthari's eyes steadily. "We looked at your records on Theta Minoris IV, Ambassador. We read every survey, every expedition report, every geological analysis." "And?" Velthari asked, though she was beginning to sense the answer. Osei smiled again, and this time there was something in it that Velthari could not quite categorize. Something that was not arrogance, but was in the same neighborhood as confidence, and further down that road than any 63-year spacefaring civilization had any right to be. "It looked like home," Osei said. The Senate debate on the human application lasted 4 days. It was, by any historical measure, one of the more unusual debates in the Senate's long record. Not because the subject matter was unprecedented, colonial development applications were routine, but because of the peculiar dynamic that emerged almost immediately. Every species that spoke against the application did so with something that was difficult to categorize as simple opposition. It was closer to concern, even in some cases to something that might generously be described as protective instinct. The Delhari senator Pras Uvin, an elder statesman whose species had lost their own expedition to Theta Minoris nearly a century earlier, stood at the Senate podium on the second day and delivered what many observers would later describe as the most emotionally transparent speech of his career. I do not oppose this application because I doubt human capability, he said, his voice carrying the characteristic harmonic resonance of the Delhari speech organs. I oppose it because I have read the reports from Mirosin. I have seen what that world does, and I find myself. He paused, and something shifted in his expression that required careful interspecies empathy training to read correctly. I find myself not wishing to see it done to them. There was a silence in the Senate chamber that was, for an institution normally defined by its noise, quite striking. The human delegation's representative, a young man named Callum Reed, whose official title was Colonial Development Liaison, stood in response and said something that was subsequently quoted in 17 different galactic news publications. "Senator Uven," he said, with what appeared to be genuine warmth rather than political performance, "that might be the kindest thing anyone has said to us since we joined this Senate. We thank you for it, and we understand completely." He paused. "We're going anyway." The first human ships arrived at Theta Minoris IV on a Tuesday. This fact would later become something of a running observation among xenosociologists studying human behavior because the humans themselves seemed to find it faintly amusing, and because it led directly to the phrase that would eventually be associated with this entire chapter of galactic history. There were 4 ships in the initial colonial mission, not the massive generation ship-class vessels that most species deployed for major colonial efforts, but 4 mid-sized vessels that the humans called, without apparent irony, their pioneer class. Each one was packed not with the populations of desperate or adventurous civilians, but with specialists, engineers, geologists, meteorologists, xenobiologists, medical personnel, construction crews, and soldiers. Though the humans who filled those roles were not called soldiers on this mission, they were called the Colonial Security Detachment. The distinction, as Velthari would come to understand, was not merely semantic. In command of the entire operation was a woman named Commander Elena Vasquez, 44 years old by human reckoning, former Earth Defense Fleet officer, graduate of the United Earth Colonial Authority's Advanced Deployment Program. She had participated in 2 previous colonial establishments, both on worlds that were, by Theta Minoris IV standards, comparable to quiet garden retreats. She had read every record on Theta Minoris IV 3 times. She had made her team read them twice. Then she had spent 6 months designing a colonial infrastructure plan specifically engineered for a world that would try, regularly and creatively, to kill them all. The Senate had been permitted, as part of the conditional approval of the colonial application, which had passed ultimately by a narrow margin, partly because the humans had technically met every legal requirement and partly because several senators had privately admitted they simply wanted to see what would happen, to place a monitoring satellite in orbit around Theta Minoris IV. The satellite's data feed was publicly accessible. Within a week of the human ship's arrival, it had become the most watched public broadcast in the history of the Galactic Senate's media archives. Day 1. The ships landed in a formation that the Vorkai's military historians recognized as a defensive perimeter, not clustered together where a single tectonic event could damage all of them simultaneously, but spread across a 5-kilometer area on the most geologically stable plateau the human surveyors had identified. Each landing site was connected to the others by what the mission documents described as hardened surface pathways, essentially roads, but built from materials specifically designed to flex rather than crack under tectonic stress. Within 6 hours of landing, automated geological sensors had been deployed in a radius of 50 kilometers. Within 12 hours, a preliminary weather monitoring network was operational. Within 24 hours, the humans had a functional early warning system that could detect incoming tectonic events an average of 40 minutes before they occurred. The first tectonic event struck on day 3. It registered as what the humans classified as a magnitude 7.4 earthquake. By Theta Minoris IV standards, this was a relatively modest event. The geological records showed events 3 times as powerful occurring regularly. But it would have been sufficient on its own to collapse the prefabricated structures that most colonial expeditions relied on in their early establishment phase. The human structures did not collapse. They flexed. Their foundation systems, designed in close collaboration with Earth's earthquake engineering research programs, absorbed and distributed the seismic energy in ways that the Vorkai engineering analysts reviewing the satellite data described in their formal report as unexpectedly sophisticated. Velthari read that report in her Senate office and thought about Amara Osei, saying the planet looked like home. She was beginning to understand what the human woman had meant. Day 7 brought the first major storm. Theta Minoris IV's weather systems were capable of generating what the human meteorological team classified as a Category 5 equivalent, wind speeds that could shred standard colonial shelter materials and rainfall intense enough to cause flash flooding across entire valley systems within hours. The humans had built drainage networks first, before the habitation modules, before the power generation systems, before most of the internal infrastructure. Drainage networks, flood barriers, and what their engineering documents called storm anchoring systems, essentially ways of physically securing every structure to bedrock so that winds capable of overthrowing large trees could not lift their buildings from the ground. The storm lasted 31 hours. When it ended, the human settlement was intact. Muddy and battered and missing 3 of their external sensor arrays that would need to be replaced, but intact. Commander Vasquez's official mission log for that day read, "Storm cleared. All personnel accounted for. Sensor arrays 3, 7, and 12 need replacement. Chen says she can fabricate new housings from local materials, starting on that tomorrow. Good day overall." The Galactic Senate Monitoring Team's report on that same day ran to 47 pages. It was the fauna that most observers had expected to be the decisive factor. Theta Minoris IV's apex predators, the creatures that xenobiologists had classified as apex coordinated hunters, or more informally as the PAX, were unlike anything in the standard galactic wildlife database. Each individual animal was approximately the size of a large Earth ungulate, with a biology adapted to the planet's extreme conditions in ways that made them effectively immune to most standard deterrent measures. Their skin had a natural electrical resistance that made energy weapons unreliable. Their skeletal structure was dense enough to absorb impacts that would be lethal to most species. And they coordinated, not with the simple pack dynamics of most social predators, but with something that the xenobiologists, after considerable internal debate, reluctantly described as genuine tactical planning. They had been observed using terrain features deliberately, creating ambushes, sending individual members ahead to test defenses while the main group waited and watched. They had broken every previous colonial expedition's perimeter, always. Sometimes it had taken weeks, sometimes less. On day 12, they found the human settlement. The colony's sensor network detected the pack approximately 90 minutes before they reached the settlement perimeter. There were 23 animals in this particular group, a large coordinating unit by the species standards. The thermal imaging data showed them moving in the precise staggered formation that the xenobiological records associated with their most sophisticated ambush behavior. Commander Vasquez was watching the sensor feeds when the pack was first detected. She called a settlement-wide alert, which brought every member of the colonial mission to their designated stations. Medical teams to the central facility, engineering crews securing the external equipment, the colonial security detachment taking positions at the perimeter, and then she did something that caused considerable subsequent analysis among the xenosociological community studying this mission. She went to the perimeter herself, not to fight. She brought no weapon. She brought Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the mission's chief xenobiologist, and a piece of equipment that Tanaka had been developing since their departure from Earth, a long-range acoustic projection system designed to reproduce, with reasonable accuracy, the low-frequency communication signals that the pack species used. They had been listening to the pack's communications through the sensor network for 12 days, recording, analyzing, building a basic pattern recognition framework that was nowhere near a translation, but was sufficient to identify what Tanaka described as the emotional register of different signal types. Vasquez stood at the perimeter as 23 of the most dangerous predators on a planet designed to kill everything on it approached through the pre-dawn darkness, and she let Tanaka run the acoustic system. What came out of that system was not language. It was not communication in any sophisticated sense. It was, in Tanaka's careful clinical description, a reconstruction of the signal pattern associated with non-threat declaration, based on recorded instances of the pack species interacting with environmental features rather than prey. In simpler terms, it was the best approximation they could produce of the sound a large, dangerous thing makes when it is telling other large, dangerous things that something nearby is not worth attacking. The pack stopped. 200 meters from the perimeter, 23 apex predators in their perfect staggered ambush formation, and they stopped. They stayed at 200 meters for 4 hours. Then they left. Tanaka's mission log for that night was considerably longer than Vasquez's typically terse entries. It ran to several thousand words of densely packed xenobiological observation. But the line that was subsequently quoted in the most galactic publications was near the end. I don't know if it worked because they believed us or because we confused them enough that the tactical calculation shifted. But I keep thinking about the fact that our first instinct, when faced with something designed by this planet to be an apex predator, was to try to talk to it. I'm not sure what that says about us. I think it might say something good. The resonance cascade struck on day 29 in 400 years of recorded galactic history. No colonial expedition had survived a resonance cascade on Theta Minoris IV. The electromagnetic disruption was simply too complete, too sudden, and too prolonged. Equipment failed. Communications collapsed. In the chaos of sudden technological blindness, the planet's other hazards, the seismic activity, the storms, the fauna became insurmountable. The Senate's monitoring satellite lost its data feed at 0347 hours colony local time. It did not reestablish contact for 11 hours and 22 minutes. In the Galactic Senate complex, in the Public Monitoring Center that had been established specifically to track the human colonial mission, there were representatives of 16 different species present when the feed went dark. Some had been following the mission since the beginning, academic interest slowly shading into something more personal. Some had only recently begun watching, drawn by the growing reputation of the broadcasts. When the satellite feed cut out, the room went very quiet. Velthari Osson was there. She had been there most days, she had come to realize, in the way that one develops habits without quite noticing when they begin. She was there with her aide Sarath, who had long since abandoned any pretense of clinical detachment and had taken to bringing supplementary snacks for what had become, in practice, a daily viewing session. The 11 hours and 22 minutes that followed were, Velthari would later say, among the longest of her Senate career. There was nothing to watch, nothing to analyze, nothing to do except sit with the knowledge that on a planet 2 light years away, 400 humans were experiencing something that had ended every previous colonial attempt, and there was no way to know how they were faring until the planet decided to let communications through again. Senator Pros Uven arrived at the monitoring center at approximately the 4-hour mark. He said nothing when he entered, simply took a seat near the back of the room and settled in with the particular stillness of a being who has decided to wait out something difficult. Others came and went, some watching, some leaving when the silence became too heavy, and returning when the pull of needing to know overcame the discomfort of not knowing. At hour 9, someone brought food. It was consumed largely in silence. At hour 11, Sarath, who had been monitoring the satellite system status throughout, said quietly, "Ambassador, signal restoration is initiating." The room, which had been maintaining a low background hum of subdued conversation, went completely silent. The satellite feed reestablished at 15:09 hours colony local time. The image that came through was, for a moment, difficult to parse. The camera systems needed several seconds to recalibrate after the electromagnetic disruption. When the image resolved, it showed the human settlement from above, in the satellite's standard wide-angle survey mode. Everything was still standing. It took the room a moment to process this, to understand what they were seeing, because the image was not the image of a colony that had survived by luck or by the skin of its teeth. The image showed a settlement that was, so far as the satellite's sensors could determine, functionally intact. Damaged, certainly. The external sensor arrays had taken significant losses, and 2 of the outlying equipment depots appeared to have been compromised, but standing, operational, inhabited. Someone in the monitoring room made a sound. It was not a word. It was the kind of sound that happens when something you have been bracing against doesn't arrive, and your body doesn't quite know what to do with the relief. Commander Vasquez's voice came through the communication system 40 seconds after the satellite feed restored. Her tone was exactly what it had been in every previous communication. Calm, measured, professionally, matter-of-fact. Theta Minoris IV colonial mission to Galactic Senate Monitoring Station. Resonance cascade duration approximately 11 hours. We implemented pre-planned EM disruption protocol at cascade onset. All personnel accounted for. 14 injuries, none critical. Significant damage to external sensor arrays currently being assessed and prioritized for repair. Settlement structurally intact. We are continuing operations. Vasquez out. The room was silent for a long moment after the communication ended. Then Senator Uven, from his seat at the back of the room, said something in Delhare that Velthari's translator rendered as, "They planned for it." He did not sound surprised exactly. He sounded like someone who had suspected something and had just had it confirmed. He sounded, Velthari thought, like someone who was revising an assumption they had been carrying for a very long time. "They planned for it," he said again, in the common galactic tongue this time, as though he wanted to hear the words in a language that everyone present would understand without translation. They knew it was coming, not when, but that it would come, and they built a protocol before they landed. They sat on their homeworld 2 light years away, and they looked at every failure that came before them, and they asked themselves not, "How do we prevent this?" but "How do we survive this when it happens?" He was quiet for a moment. "That is a different question," he said finally. "That is a fundamentally different way of thinking about a problem." In the weeks that followed, the human settlement on Theta Minoris IV did not merely survive, it grew. The xenobiological team expanded their acoustic communication research with the pack species into what Tanaka described, with characteristic scientific caution, as preliminary non-hostile coexistence patterns. The engineering teams repaired and improved their sensor networks after each new disruption event. The geological survey teams began mapping the tectonic systems with a level of granular detail that had never been attempted, identifying patterns in what had previously been classified as random chaos. Because, as Commander Vasquez noted in one of her mission logs, there's no such thing as true randomness at the geological scale. There are just systems we don't understand yet. We're going to understand this one. The pack returned 14 times over the next 2 months. On 7 of those occasions, the acoustic communication system was sufficient to establish what Tanaka cautiously began calling non-aggressive withdrawal. On 3 occasions, the Colonial Security Detachment deployed non-lethal deterrent measures, and the pack retreated. On 4 occasions, the pack simply watched the settlement from a distance for several hours and then left on their own. On the 61st day, Tanaka recorded something in her mission log that she prefaced with a note indicating she was aware it sounded implausible and was including it with full acknowledgement of the limitations of the observational data. 3 members of the pack had approached the settlement perimeter alone, without the rest of the group, during a period when a Category 3 storm was building to the north. They had stationed themselves approximately 50 meters from the settlement's outermost boundary, and remained there, unmoving, for 2 hours. They had left when the storm broke in a different direction than initially projected. Tanaka wrote, "I don't want to overinterpret behavioral data from a species we have been studying for less than 3 months. The methodological constraints are significant, but I watched those 3 animals for 2 hours, and I kept thinking about the sensor readings, and I kept thinking about how their positioning relative to the settlement would have put them between us and the storm's projected path. And I don't know what to do with that thought except write it down and keep watching." Velthari read that particular mission log entry 3 times. Then she sat in her office for a long time, looking at the photograph of the Vorkai expedition memorial that sat on her desk. 1,200 names, her great-grandmother's among them. She thought about what it must feel like to look at a world that had killed 1,200 of your people and call it a challenge rather than a verdict. She thought about what it must feel like to grow up on a planet that had been hit by the equivalent of another planet, that had been through 5 extinction events, that had been crossed by people in wooden boats using the stars for navigation, and to carry all of that history so thoroughly inside you that when you looked at something the rest of the galaxy called impossible, your first response was not fear, but curiosity. She thought about Amara Osei saying it looked like home. She thought she was finally beginning to understand. On the 120th day of the Theta Minoris IV colonial mission, Commander Elena Vasquez submitted a formal status report to the United Earth Colonial Authority, and as required by the terms of their Senate-approved permit, to the Galactic Senate Monitoring Committee. It was a thorough document. 23 pages of engineering assessments, biological surveys, meteorological data, geological mapping progress, and personnel status updates. It was written in the precise functional style that had characterized every communication from the mission, clear, honest, detailed, and completely without drama. The final paragraph read, "Overall mission status, nominal. Theta Minoris IV presents ongoing significant environmental challenges across all operational categories. Our adaptive response protocols continue to evolve based on observed conditions. Recommend proceeding with Phase 2 infrastructure development as planned. This world is difficult. It is also extraordinary. We intend to stay." Senator Ufen requested the floor in the Galactic Senate chamber 3 days after the report was distributed. He was, by any measure, not a naturally theatrical being. The Delhari were a species that valued precision and restraint in public communication. Uven had built his career on exactly these qualities: the careful word, the measured argument, the diplomatic understatement. What he said in the Senate chamber that day was, for him, extravagant. "I have spent the last 4 months watching human beings do something that our best scientific and military assessments told us was impossible," he said, "and I have spent those 4 months trying to understand not just what they were doing, but how they were thinking while they did it." He paused, and the Senate chamber, never a quiet place, was unusually still. "I think I have identified something," he continued. "It is not a technology. It is not a strategy precisely, though it produces strategies. It is something more fundamental than either of those things." Another pause. "Most species, when they encounter a challenge that has defeated all previous attempts, draw a conclusion. They catalog the failures. They identify the variables that cause those failures, and they make a determination about whether the probability of success justifies the cost of another attempt. This is rational. This is good science. This is how civilizations protect themselves from unnecessary loss." He looked at the human delegation section of the chamber. Young Callum Reed was watching him with an expression that Uven had learned, over months of careful observation, to recognize as the human version of respectful attention. "Humans do something different," Uven said. "They look at the failures and they ask a different question. They do not ask, 'Can this be done?' They ask, 'What do we need to learn in order to do it?' The failures, to human thinking, are not verdicts. They are data. Each one tells them something they did not know before. Each one makes the next attempt slightly less likely to fail in the same way. He paused again. This sounds like a small distinction. It is not. It is, I have come to believe, one of the most significant cognitive differences between human beings and most other spacefaring species. He looked down at the prepared notes he had not, in fact, consulted at all during his remarks. I oppose their application, he said quietly. I opposed it because I had seen what Theta Minoris IV does, and I did not want to see it done to them. I thought I was being compassionate. I was also, I understand now, being something else. He looked up. I was being afraid on their behalf. And humans, and I say this not as an insult, but as the most genuine form of admiration I know how to express, humans do not particularly require other species to be afraid on their behalf. He closed his notes. They are still there, he said, on a planet that has never permitted any civilization to remain. They are still there, and they are learning its systems, and they are making protocols for its disasters, and one of their scientists is writing careful, methodologically cautious notes about the possibility that the planet's apex predators may have positioned themselves to protect the settlement from a storm. He let that land for a moment, because apparently that is what humans do. They go somewhere impossible, and they stay until it is no longer impossible, and along the way they somehow make friends with the things that were supposed to kill them. The Senate chamber was quiet. I do not know, Senator Uven said finally, what the correct scientific term is for a species that treats the unconquerable as a starting point rather than a conclusion. I only know that I have been watching them for 4 months, and I find that I am no longer afraid for them. He paused one final time. I find that I am instead simply glad that they exist. Velthari Asan filed her own statement with the Senate record the following day. It was shorter than Uven's. 3 paragraphs. The last one read, My great-grandmother's name is on the memorial to the Vorkai hegemony's first Theta Minoris expedition. For 400 years, that memorial has stood as a reminder of what that world costs. I have spent my career understanding that cost as a limit, a boundary beyond which reasonable beings do not venture. I understand now that this was my own limitation, not the universe's. There are beings in this galaxy for whom the memorial represents not a boundary, but a beginning, a record of what the problem looked like before they started solving it. I am grateful to have lived long enough to see this. I am grateful that they are here. The Theta Minoris IV colony, formerly named New Meridian by its inhabitants, marked its first anniversary on a Tuesday. Commander Vasquez's mission log for that day was unusually longer than her standard operational entries. She had written it in the early morning, before the rest of the settlement had come fully online for the day, sitting at the observation window of the Central Command Facility and watching the sun rise over a planet that had spent a year trying its best to kill them. She wrote about the 14 people who had been injured in the resonance cascade and had all recovered fully. She wrote about Dr. Tanaka's xenobiological research, which had by then produced what was quietly being called the most significant non-human behavioral study in a decade. She wrote about the pack, 3 of whose members had, in the past month, taken to appearing individually near the settlement's perimeter during morning hours, simply observing in a behavior that Tanaka had classified as curious, non-aggressive reconnaissance, and that most of the settlement had started referring to informally as the morning visitors. She wrote about her engineering team's geological mapping project, which had identified a pattern in the tectonic system that the team's lead geologist had described as not random at all, actually. It's more like breathing, and which, if the pattern held, would give them predictive capability for major events up to 72 hours in advance. She wrote about the storms, and the protocols, and the 14 injuries, and the sensor arrays they had replaced 4 times, and the drainage networks that had kept them dry through 11 major flooding events. And then, at the end, she wrote this: "A year ago, we landed on a world that every civilization before us had decided was not worth the cost. I understand why they made that decision. I understand it better now than I did then, having lived here through what this planet does. It is not an easy place. It is not a forgiving place. It does not care in any sense whether we are here or not. But I also understand something else now that I only suspected a year ago. The things that make this world hard are the same things that make it extraordinary. The same geological forces that cause the Cascades have created mineral deposits of a density and variety that our survey teams are still cataloging. The same atmospheric dynamics that build the storms we have learned to survive are creating weather patterns that regulate a biosphere of remarkable complexity and beauty. The same evolutionary pressures that produce the pack have produced a species of non-human intelligence whose behavioral sophistication our xenobiological team is only beginning to appreciate. This planet has been trying to kill us for a year. It has not succeeded. In the process, it has given us more scientific data, more engineering knowledge, more xenobiological insight, and more reasons to stay than any world we have settled before. I think that is probably true of most hard things if you stay long enough. New Meridian, Year 1, all hands present, proceeding to Year 2. And for the first time, the galaxy understood what it truly meant to be human, not in the grand moments of battle or political triumph, not in the sweeping gestures of civilization building or the dramatic victories that filled history books, but in this, the quiet decision made by 400 ordinary people on a Tuesday morning to unpack their equipment on a world that the universe had decided was finished, and to begin with patience and curiosity and the particular stubbornness of a species that had survived 5 extinction events, the long and unglamorous and extraordinary work of making it home. They had not conquered Theta Minoris IV. They had not defeated it. They had done something that in 400 years no other civilization had thought to try. They had stayed. They had listened. They had learned its patterns and planned for its disasters and spoken to its predators in frequencies they barely understood and watched its sunrises from observation windows and written careful notes about the possibility that something designed by evolution to be a killing machine might, under the right circumstances, decide to protect the strange soft creatures who had arrived on its world and inexplicably refused to leave. They had stayed, and in staying they had changed the question. Not can this world be survived, but what becomes possible when you decide to find out. If this story moved you, if you felt that pride, that quiet awe, that reminder of what human beings are capable of when they decide that impossible is just another word for not yet, then you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to HFY Legends and join us every week for more human stories from the stars. We will be here. We always are.